Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Strife Hayes, and this is a video about how the meta ruins MMORPGs. I'd like to thank the YouTube user Gary of Nivea for suggesting this video idea. Thank you, Gary. It was a great question for me to think about. As usual with these analytical videos, we'll explain what the meta is in relation to MMORPGs, how it happens, why it's bad, and various solutions to it. This video will be quite long, so grab a drink and settle in as we discuss the meta and why it ruins MMORPGs. The word meta has a few different meanings in various forms of media. The most often seen is when a piece of media or art has knowledge outside of itself, or interacts with the world in a way that's usually limited by the conventions of said media. An example would be in Metal Gear Solid 1, the PlayStation 1 action-adventure game, where you need to physically move your controller from slot 1 to slot 2 on the PlayStation console, or the boss will always be able to predict your moves. The game shouldn't be aware it's a game, and it shouldn't be able to request a player switch their controller, but it does. That is meta. A theatre show where the actors break the fourth wall and talk to the audience. A comic or film character, such as Deadpool, being aware he's a character. These are all meta. There's a brilliant example in the MMORPG old school RuneScape, where if a character starts a quest already carrying the exact items they'll need to finish it, which would only be possible if you were using a quest guide and came prepared, the in-game dialogue will call you out and comment on how lucky it is you're already carrying just what you need, which is a lovely meta joke by the writers. However, in MMORPG gameplay, it has a slightly different meaning. MMORPGs are, at their core, large-scale adventure games featuring many players taking on tasks and challenges. These challenges could be part of the game designed by the developers, such as bosses or quests, or player-made challenges like PvP or speedruns of certain sections. But as players become more and more experienced and more skilled, certain tricks or tactics will emerge for each of these challenges, making them easier. Eventually, we will, as a community or a single player, reach a point where any challenge in the game is made trivial because our knowledge of that challenge is so complete we can win with almost no problem. When this situation happens, players have essentially solved the game. That is known as the meta. All video games are simply a battle of behind-the-scenes numbers. MMORPGs are no different. If you're a damage dealer or DPS, you need to push your numbers as high as possible. Tanks and defensive players need more health, damage mitigation, armor or dodge chances. Healers need to restore as much HP as possible. It's all about numbers, and the journey to find the absolute best numbers for every situation is the search for the meta. It's not just combat this applies to. Everything within a competitive or cooperative game has a meta. In old school RuneScape, again, there are places where fishing, woodcutting, firemaking, all of the in-game skills can be trained slightly faster, slightly more efficiently. Making sure you are following this efficient training routine is following the meta. So why is this bad? Surely the meta is simply a reward for a player finding the most efficient way to do something. Your skill has paid off, your time invested is worth it, and you've reached the top of the pedestal. Well done. How is the meta bad? There's a great deal of joy in achieving the top, the best of something. The elation and feeling of achievement when you can finally say, yes, I've done it, can make people very happy. But just like anyone who's ever felt the pit of emptiness after achieving something, the journey and the adventure toward the goal is often the fun part. So while hunting the meta can be fun, actually achieving it can kill the feeling of enjoyment within a game. Knowing this, let's discuss why the meta is bad. While it mainly depends on exactly what you're trying to do, the most general example is this. The existence and knowledge of the meta way to complete any task renders every other approach of that task at best inferior, and at worst completely pointless. To put that simply, if there exists a way to catch 100 fish in an hour and another way to catch 50 of the same fish in an hour, why would you ever choose the 50 method? You'd be limiting yourself, which means the 50 method may as well not exist. It's completely outclassed. The meta also exists for equipment, which is a vital part of every MMORPG. What to wear can be the difference between life and death, so why would you ever wear anything below the absolute best? This situation, the meta, is a large problem in MMORPGs because it heavily limits what you as a player can do, what you can wear, and how you should play if your end goal is to be competitive. It's no longer about wearing what looks cool or playing in a fun style, it's about manipulating those behind-the-scenes numbers to go as high as they can, and you'll often have to sacrifice both personal freedom and genuine fun to be able to do that. It removes the role-playing element. Your character isn't so much your own personal extension into the world as they are a conduit for efficient gameplay. For example, in Guild Wars 2, I performed far better as a DPS wizard using a greatsword instead of using a staff, which is a shame because I really wanted to use a staff. In The Elder Scrolls Online, the game being played in the background now, the meta is to animation cancel between attacks. This makes your movements appear jerky and sporadic, not exactly beautiful, but essential to keep up with the meta. Not just play styles, but vast areas of the game are affected too. Once you're at maximum level, you don't have reason to return to the lower levels. When hunting for equipment, you're not going to hunt for less than the best, the meta, meaning the entirety of the game content before the meta is now completely obsolete. If you're a casual player and thinking this doesn't affect you, then on some level you're right. You won't need to use third-party programs to build your equipment, or skill points, or watch YouTube guides on how to be efficient. You can play how you like. But remember, those playing to the meta will be pushing even further ahead of you, gaining more levels, more gold, and more items, until the gap in wealth and power is so large you'll effectively never be able to catch up. When you do try and catch up, you'll find the higher level capable players are all doing the endgame dungeons or raids, and there's no one to fall back a bit and help you, because helping a lower leveled or lower geared player isn't helping them push the meta. So how do we fix it? How do you build an MMORPG which prevents players discovering the meta and then railroading toward it? The DPS being the highest, the tank being the toughest, the most efficient skilling method. How do we stop it, and what do we replace it with? I can see several areas we need to look at and fix, and don't worry, I've got a few tried and tested solutions for all of them. I think we need to address the following points. Classes having meta builds, endgame dungeons having meta equipment, non-combat skills having meta training methods, and bosses and enemies having meta tactics. Let's start with the first, classes having meta builds. Imagine a game with a warrior and a mage. The warrior and mage are both damage dealers, and the mage does way more, so everyone plays him. The mage is now the meta. So the developers patch the game, and now the warrior is on top. The warrior is now the meta, and players will switch. It's important to note that most competitive players aren't playing either class because they actually like the class. They're playing them because they like the meta. They like winning. So we need to give the ability to win to both of these classes, and there are two main ways of doing this. The first, the way that almost never works, is to balance both classes so played under ideal conditions they're absolutely equal in terms of damage. Both the warrior and the mage can, in almost every situation, put out the same numbers. This has the benefit of keeping it totally fair and equal at the cost of homogenizing the game. Both classes would be equal, nothing to set them apart from each other. This balance method involves bringing the classes together, so the meta is the same. The second, and my personal preferred method, is to embrace the differences within classes in MMORPGs and build tasks and challenges within the game that favour the various classes at various points. For example, imagine a boss entirely resistant to magic damage, surrounded by henchmen entirely resistant to physical damage. In this situation, you'd need both a warrior and a mage to succeed. This version of manipulating the meta involves keeping the classes different, but providing both advantages or disadvantages to each class in various situations. You could quite easily create a boss that gains resistance to a certain damage type the more it gets hit with that type. So taking a team of warriors or a team of mages would be equally bad, as the resistance to your team's damage type would build up until the boss is essentially unkillable. In this case, variation is your greatest strength. In Neverwinter, only rogues could spot and disarm traps, which was a lovely game mechanic when traps killed you, until they made traps essentially useless and pointless, and then removed one of the unique and interesting ways to play a rogue. Now, this solution doesn't address the issues within the class itself, just the various classes against each other. There could be many ways to play a warrior, but only one meta way. How do we solve the problems within the individual classes? Well, I'd suggest the same way. Don't try and bring every weapon or armor piece into a homogenized middle zone where they're all essentially the same, but instead celebrate the differences and allow all the advantages to be matched with an equal disadvantage. A huge, heavy greatsword should do more damage per swing than a dagger, but it should also be slow and easy to dodge. A small rapier should be great at harming enemies with no armor, but essentially useless against heavily armored foes. Once again, this simply requires the game developers to create situations with varied challenges and enemies with various weaknesses, to guarantee that every build and every setup of every class is useful in some way. Don't destroy or balance the meta. Just increase the amount of metas you need to match for any given situation. Endgame dungeons having meta equipment. How do we solve this? Well, Neverwinter Mod 2 actually did this better than any other game I've ever played. Instead of tying the equipment level to a single dungeon, so the hardest dungeon has the best stuff, they spread the parts of every armor set across multiple dungeons, and then gave each set powerful effects when worn together. So if you need the helmet, you'd have to go to Dungeon 1, the legs were in Dungeon 2, the gloves in Dungeon 3, and every class had the same dungeons to go to, meaning you never had a situation where you and your friends were running one dungeon for hours on end, but instead cycling through multiples to find the equipment parts you each needed. Once you had a full set, you'd have to go for the set above it, which was again spread out over even more dungeons. This created the situation where, as you needed to gather more equipment, yet more and more people were willing to help you with a dungeon if you helped them with another. There were even situations where, in certain dungeons or certain team compositions, wearing the lower-leveled armor was a better idea because the set effect would help your team out more. Then you had meta items where only crafters were able to make them and then sell them to other people. You had meta situations where only a ranger was able to get a drop that would have worked for a warrior, and so trading was essential. Instead of tying the meta of what you need behind one thing, spread it out so you need to do multiple things within the game to get it. And then don't make the very top stuff that much better than the second best, the third best, or the fourth best. The very, very top should be a reward for players willing to put in hundreds of hours of time, and it should carry more prestige than stats. It shouldn't be about making you overpowered as simply making you respected within the community. The meta doesn't need to make you unkillable. The meta just needs to make you somewhat famous, which is a much better reward for people involved in MMORPGs. So we can help classes and equipment become less meta by simply spreading out the situations where each class would be useful and increasing the number of places each item could be found or acquired from. So next is non-combat skills having meta training methods. If various methods exist for training a non-combat skill, such as one woodcutting place giving 100 experience and another giving 1,000, you're going to choose the 1,000. So how do we change that? The solutions we have are: manipulate all the experience rates to be equal across all training methods. That simply means the meta will shift to whichever location is nearest to a bank or has the most resources available, so that won't fix the meta, just displace it within the game world. We could instead buff the rewards for the lower place, lower the harder place, give bonuses, give debuffs. No matter what we do, the meta for skilling will switch. So how can the developers create a situation where skilling doesn't necessarily have a meta? Again, don't remove it, simply add more. Buff the experience certain skills gain on certain days, or give specific skilling locations massive bonuses but only for a few hours or a few minutes at a time, and have them switch randomly. If you create a static gaming environment, you'll create a static meta. But have your game switch and change, have the numbers change or vary within parameters, and suddenly you've created a gaming environment where the players have to actively search for the best. And it's quite possible the time spent searching, constantly chasing meta, will become a time waste. So skilling in your favourite place might end up being worthwhile, because when the bonus experience suddenly applies to your skilling location, you'll be there to reap the rewards. Allowing the game world to change and morph and mix, instead of simply being one static set number, will allow the players to explore it as if it truly were a living world. The final meta problem is bosses and enemies, their rotation of attacks, their strategies in battle being known. How do we remove the meta from a much more popular situation? Now this one sounds more complex, but it's actually more simple. Variation of the numbers behind the scenes. And I don't just mean increasing the HP of the boss, because a meat shield fight is never fun. Earlier we talked about using a huge greatsword should have the disadvantage of being very slow because they hit huge damage. Imagine if you and your team walked into a boss room and suddenly discovered the boss's speed and dodging had been increased by 20%, but their defense had been lowered by 20% as well. Your strong attacks might kill it quicker if you could actually hit it, which you're struggling to do, because now the faster, more accurate weapons have the advantage, meaning the meta has switched as soon as you entered the room. Have boss fights in arenas that can apply various elemental buffs or debuffs. One attempt could see the boss being surrounded by a flame shield, negating or reducing fire damage and harming close combat fighters, meaning you would need to switch to using ice spells and your healers focusing on keeping the fighters alive. But the next attempt at the same boss could see them being surrounded by a metal shield, increasing the magic damage they take but decreasing the physical. These changes would mean your team composition cannot follow a pre-established meta. You would never be left out of a team because you're useless, because you do not know what the boss is going to be weak to. You don't know what situation you're going to face. You would instead need to put together a team of people able to react and adapt to multiple situations and bring various weapons and armor sets with them. A gaming environment becoming more reactive and adaptable cannot, by its definition, have a pre-established meta. To take this example into the real world, and away from MMORPGs for a moment, I play both the card game Magic the Gathering and the tabletop battle game Warhammer 40k. Both of them are different, but they both focus on defeating your opponent. If one week every single Magic the Gathering player brings a certain type of deck, then next week I will bring the solution, a deck designed to beat those previous styles. But what if the week after they realise what I've done and they bring something to counter me, or one I'm not weak to or strong against? The same with Warhammer. If I design my army to beat what I know will be there, I'm leaving myself vulnerable to other strategies. The solution is to bring what you are good at playing and a few generic answers to any situations you haven't seen. Applying this to MMORPGs would mean if you want to be a fire damage dealing mage, that's absolutely fine. But it's probably best to have a few ice spells as a backup, just in case the enemy suddenly gains a fire resistance, and then maybe even a dagger to get in close stabbing, just in case the magic resistance is too high. I'm not saying don't play the style you like, that would be silly. MMOs are about role-playing and following your role. But be willing to switch your role on the fly if you need to, when the game adapts to beat you. MMORPGs are complex games and I'm not a game developer, I am a player, so my suggestions come from the point of view of a player. However, I don't believe it would be too difficult to implement these game mechanics. I'm not pushing for a huge graphical change or massive amounts of content to be created. I'm asking for the behind-the-scenes numbers, the code that governs the fight mechanics, the skilling spots, or the damage output of a player to be switched or varied within a minimum and maximum parameter, to create a game environment that cannot be ultimately solved, but instead should be played within by the players who enjoy the mechanics of a class and are rewarded when learning their class and being able to take on multiple situations. What do you think? Does the meta ruin games? Is chasing the meta tiring, or do you enjoy it? And do you think any of the proposed solutions would remove the meta and replace it with something more enjoyable, something more fluid, something more dynamic or organic, a changing gaming environment? Let me know in the comments below or drop me a message on Discord, link in the description. If you want to chat live, come and say hi on Twitch over at twitch.tv/Josh Strife Hayes. Thank you very much for your time. Once again, thank you for your questions and have a great day.